My name is Robin Rumney, and I'm the Ontario KBA coordinator with WCS Canada. With me today are two members of the Canadian KBA Secretariat, also with WCS Canada. So we have Jamie Grimm, the KBA Research Associate, and Dr. Kira Radsapuran, the Canada Key Biodiversity Area Program Lead. You will be hearing from Jamie and me today in presentations, and Kira will be helping to answer questions after the presentation. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking with you today from Treaty 16 territory, home of the Huron-Wendat, Mississauga, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee nations. Some housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. Just please keep yourself muted. Everyone has so far, so that's great. And put any questions you have in the chat at any time. We'll have time at the end to go over all of the questions in the chat, and you'll also have the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask questions through the mic. If you do have any urgent points of clarification to ask, if you're not understanding or following or we've missed something, please put this in the chat or raise your hand and we'll address this before we move on. So we want to make sure everyone's following what we're going through today. Keep in mind that this meeting will go into some more technical details on the KBA methods. So if you're new to the concept or you have any questions regarding the basics, please feel free to reach out during the meeting in the chat or after the meeting by email, and you can request background information. We have some videos we can send you, and as well some documents you can read to catch up or to learn more after this meeting as well. But we're going to try to gear this to everyone. So if you haven't heard of KBAs, we'll have some basic information, but if you were at our kickoff meeting, we're going to be expanding on that today as well. If you haven't already filled out the survey in the reminder email I sent, or the survey from the kickoff meeting a few weeks ago, please take the time to fill that out. It was, and if you don't have it, I can link it in the chat during this meeting. This gives you an opportunity to share your name and contact information, where you work and your expertise. And this will help us to reach out to people who might be able to provide us with important information on our Ontario KBA work. Our goal today is to train you all as knowledge holders of Ontario's biodiversity sites to be able to assist us with finding potential KBA sites, doing KBA assessments, reviews, and nominations. We hope that you come out of today's meeting with more information on how the process works and how your knowledge and expertise might be useful to us and to the process. So please email me afterwards if you have any questions or comments or suggestions on KBAs within the province. To start us off today, we have Jamie, who will be introducing the Canadian KBA initiative.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar names here. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because I think a lot of you probably have already seen an introduction to the KBA initiative in some form or another. If you have any questions for clarification, please do let us know. So what are key biodiversity areas? KBAs are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. KBAs are a layer of information that's developed using a scientific approach that you'll see throughout the rest of our meeting today. And this layer of information has no management prescription. So it's really well-documented information about a special site and the species or ecosystems or other biodiversity that is found there that can then be integrated into other decision-making and planning processes like protected areas, design, land use planning, etc. So strengths of KBAs, as I said, KBAs are identified in a scientific process. They're identified in a way that's rigorous and consistent based on standardized quantitative criteria. They are a multi-species approach, so KBAs capture all types of biodiversity elements, including species and ecosystems from all different taxa and across freshwater, marine, and terrestrial realms. The identification and proposal of a KBA requires really good documentation of the process and the data. There's a standardized form and standardized data standards that I will talk about a little bit later. And really the way that we're doing the work is very participatory. And so it's building on knowledge and this existing network of biodiversity experts across Canada. And finally, it's relevant at multiple scales. So key biodiversity areas were developed as a response to a call from users. So biodiversity and conservation experts and professionals called on the IUCN to create a tool that incorporated multiple taxa and helped us identify sites in a standardized way. So the KBA Global Standard was developed in 2016 by an IUCN working group, and it documents both the process for identifying KBAs and the specific criteria that are required to identify a KBA. And Robin's going to talk about this criteria in more detail, but just to let you know quickly, KBAs can be identified for threatened biodiversity, so species or ecosystems, geographically restricted biodiversity, sites with high ecological integrity and a low industrial footprint, sites that are important for biological processes. So these are things like where species gather for mating or feeding or breeding, like caribou calving grounds or salmon spawning grounds or bat hibernacula. And finally, sites can be identified that are irreplaceable through a quantitative analysis, which we're still kind of in the works of developing exactly how we're going to be applying that standard in Canada. So the KBA Canada project was started in 2019 with the formation of the Canada KBA Coalition. And the coalition is a partnership between multiple NGO groups, governments both at the territorial, federal, and provincial levels, as well as Indigenous governments and other Indigenous organizations. It includes academic partners as well and various others. The coalition is then overseen by a management committee, which is made up of individuals from those partner organizations. And finally, the KBA Canada Secretariat is hosted here at WCS Canada, where Robin, Kira, and I all work. And we have key partners at Birds Canada and NatureServe Canada, who are instrumental in the development of various KBA databases, open access information and data products, and are helping us build the eventual KBA database, which will host all of the information about KBAs in Canada and where those sites are. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Robin.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So I'm going to be talking today about the KBA standard and the different criteria. Next slide, please. So the KBA project works off of the KBA standard. So as Jamie mentioned, globally, the KBA Secretariat came up with the global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas. And more recently, the Canadian Secretariat has come up with a Canadian document going over the same things, but for the Canadian level for national KBAs. Both of these standards are applicable to species and ecosystems in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine environments. And they both build on existing approaches to identifying important sites for biodiversity. They identify KBAs under 11 criteria that fall into the 5 broad categories that Jamie mentioned. So today I'm going to be going over some of the criteria for the categories that we're going to be most likely looking at within Ontario, and I'll go into these in a bit more detail to give you an idea how the process actually works. Next slide, please. So for A1, these are threatened species. We first of all will find, we have 5 criteria for global KBAs under A1 threatened species. So I'll go through the ones in bold in most detail because these are the ones that are most likely going to be found. But we have A1A. So A1A KBAs are sites that hold at least 0.5% of the global population size and at least 5 reproductive units of critically endangered or endangered species based on the IUCN Red List rankings, or G1 based on NatureServe. When I say reproductive units, this can vary species to species based on their life history and biology, But if you imagine a pair of monogamous, something like turtles, where if each breeding pair would be a reproductive unit, but for some species, this differs depending on how they breed. So for A1B, these are quite similar KBAs, but these are triggered when a site has at least 1% of the global population size and 10 reproductive units. But in this case, we're looking for sites that have vulnerable species based on the IUCN Red List or G2 species based on NatureServe. A1, C, and D are triggered based on IUCN Red List statuses that are listed, species that are listed due to population size reduction. So for these in the IUCN Red List, it would note that this is due to a population size reduction, and they also have thresholds for those as well. But A1E is an interesting one because it is triggered when a site holds the entire global population of a species that's listed by the IUCN Red List as being critically endangered or NatureServe as being G1. So the entire species has to be on that site. Next section, please. Thank you. So for national KBAs for A1 threatened species, we have just 3 sub-criteria. So they're similar to the global KBAs, but it moves it to a national scale. So for A1A, we're looking for sites that hold at least 0.5% of the national population size and 5 reproductive units. In this case, we're looking for species that are endangered based on COSEWIC rankings and N1 based on NatureServe species. So that would be N1 in Canada. For A1B, we're looking for sites that hold at least 1% of the national population size and at least 10 reproductive units of a COSEWIC threatened or T species and an NatureServe N2 species in Canada. A1E is again the entire population on that site, but in this case, it's the entire national scale population, and these species have to be endangered by COSEWIC or N1 by NatureServe. Next slide, please. So what is considered threatened for these threatened species? So as I mentioned, there's a few different criteria, conservation ranks that can go into this, but we use IUCN Red List categories and criteria. We use the NatureServe ranks, and we use COSEWIC or Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada ranks. So for the IUCN Red List, any species that is listed as critically endangered, or vulnerable could trigger a KBA based on A1, and NatureServe G1 and G2 species. And for COSEWIC, again, the endangered or threatened species, and NatureServe N1 or N2 at the Canadian national scale. As well, if a species is endemic to Canada, it changes things a little bit, because this means we can trigger global KBAs using COSEWIC endangered and threatened statuses and NatureServe N1 and N2. So if you do have an endemic species that you're looking at, it's worth just double checking this to make sure that you're using the appropriate ranks. Next slide, please. So we have 6 assessment parameters we use to test these thresholds and criteria. So through the examples I just went through, I talked about the population size. So in most cases, the first thing we'll look for is the number of mature individuals. But for some species, this might not be known at certain sites or at a national scale. And in some cases, this might not be able to be calculated accurately. In these cases, we'll start to move our way down this list and look for other assessment parameters. The important thing is that we have the assessment parameter values for both a site and either a global scale for global KBAs or a national scale for national KBAs. So we can also look at area of occupancy, extent of suitable habitat, range, number of localities, and distinct genetic diversity. Next slide, please. So for some of these area-based parameters, we have a little diagram just to give you an idea about how they work. So area of occupancy, this is our second choice if we don't have number of mature individuals. This is the area within the range that is actually occupied. So in this diagram, this is the squares surrounding both the known localities and the inferred occurrences, but not the vagrant localities. And for this, we calculate a 2-kilometer grid squared around each known locality or each known occurrence, and to calculate that. The extent of suitable habitat is the area of potentially suitable ecological conditions, such as based on things such as vegetation, substrate, temperature. If you're talking about an aquatic species, could be how deep in the lake you're going, or if you're on a hillside, how high up in altitude you are, to calculate that. Range is the current known limits of distribution. And again, this includes all the inferred and projected and known localities, but does not include any vagrant localities. And the number of localities is the number of locations, or the number of areas where this species is actually found. So for many KBAs, all of the element occurrences of the species in the site will be a single locality, and then you'll calculate how many of those localities there are across the country or globally, and then compare the thresholds that way. Next slide, please. So another type of KBA that we'll be looking for in Ontario are B1, or individual geographically restricted species. So for B1, we're looking for sites that hold at least 10% of the global or national population size and at least 10 reproductive units on the site. For these, they do not have to be species at risk, so they could be any species. However, 10% is a large number on the site, so they're highly concentrated and restricted to this area. So for this, we can use any of the 6 assessment parameters. And an example of a species that might trigger a B1 KBA could be something that lives in a small area of alver, where it lives its entire life cycle within this alver, and it's quite geographically restricted and densely populated within that area. Or maybe a fish in a restricted area, a restricted lake, that could trigger this. Next slide, please. So we also have D1, or demographic aggregations. So for D1A, we're looking for sites that have at least 1% of either the global or national population size of a species over a season and during at least one key stage in its life cycle. So this differs from the B criteria because it's not living in this restricted area for its entire life. It's just moving there for one life stage. For example, bats, they spread out over the summer, but in the winter they might aggregate into a common hibernaculum. So if they were there in at least 1% of their global or national population size, they could trigger this KBA. And they don't have to be species at risk for these either. They just have to be aggregating, and it has to be repetitive over many years. So it can't just be they were there last year. It has to be something like a monarch stopover during migration, where there's evidence that they've been there for years in a row. And D1B is similar, but instead of looking for a certain amount of the population, we're just looking for one of the largest 10 aggregations of the species globally or nationally. So this again could be a stopover in migration, or a breeding aggregation during one time of the year. And yeah, just number of mature individuals can be used here, and none of our other assessment parameters. Next slide. So to work with the KBA standard, there is also a guideline for using the global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas. So this guideline is very useful, and it goes over rules for application of the standard, gives things like data quality rules, how to deal with uncertainty, taxonomic differences, how these KBAs will work in a changing climate. It goes over information sources you're able to use, different definitions for a lot of key terms, for all of the key terms, approaches to site delineation, and submission guidelines. This can also be used with the national standard, and it basically just is it's almost a dictionary of information and encyclopedia to go with the standards. Next slide, please. So here are some practical steps for identifying a KBA and where a KBA might be. So the first thing you want to do is identify a rough area where the KBA is likely to be based on knowledge of the species or the site and all available data you have. So it's important to collect all available information and data on the species at this time. Next step is you identify the parameter to test the threshold. So you're looking for population numbers, range, area of occupancy, etc., at either the global scale for global KBAs or national scale for national KBAs, and also importantly, the same parameter at the site level. Next, you want to ask yourself if there's enough evidence that the reproductive units threshold is met at the site. So even if you are using an area-based parameter, you still need to meet the reproductive units threshold. So this is important. And also ask yourself how confident you are in the surveying effort and the knowledge of the species distribution. Next slide, please. So your data sources can come from multiple places, but it's important that it's recent enough and traceable to a reliable source. So sometimes for sites that are very isolated, your data might be relatively old, and in areas where there's more study, your data might be you might have more repeated sample and more new data. So this is something where it's good to check the guidelines to see if there's any rules in place for how old your data can be, or reach out to us on a case-by-case basis and we can answer any questions there. All sources of knowledge are welcome. So we can use things such as research reports, government reports, indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. All data is welcome in this process. The data must be publicly available or made available on request. And as well, you should document how the methods for estimating your parameters were done and give a description of the data in your KBA proposal. So you can use COSEBIC status reports, N ranks and G ranks that are less than 12 years old, and IUCN categories that were assigned less than 10 years ago. If you are looking at a species that hasn't been assessed as recently, it's worth reaching out to us and we can see if it's in line to be assessed, because sometimes there could be a backlog of species that need to be reassessed. So it's worth checking in again on a case-by-case basis for this. Next slide. So now I'm going to go over 2 example calculations to give you an idea of how to figure out if your site might be a KBA. So these are theoretical populations, but the first is a population of Fowler's toad on a Lake Erie beach. So the first thing you want to do is gather your information and check the conservation rank and status trigger. So for the Fowler's toad, COSEBIC has listed it as endangered and NatureServe as G5 and N2 in Canada. The IUCN Red List has listed it as stable. So now we're going to go to our KBA standard and see if this triggers a KBA, and if so, under what category. So in this case, it triggers a national KBA under A1A. So for this, our threshold is that our site has to hold at least 0.5% of the national population, and it has to have at least 5 reproductive units. Next, we want to compare the site assessment parameters to the national parameters. So for Fowler's toad, the COSEBIC report listed as having 5,000 individuals nationally. And we do a site survey and we find that there are 34 on the site. So we calculate that our site has 0.68% of the national population. And we know that it has 5 reproductive units. So we found 34 mature individuals with an equal sex ratio. So we know that our KBA criteria has been met, and we can move on to our next stages of KBA assessment for the Fowler's toad on the site. Next slide, please. So our second example is for a population of American bumblebee in an Ontario park. So again, we check our conservation rank and trigger status. So COSEBIC has listed this bumblebee as special concern. NatureServe has a range rank of G3, G4. So in this case, we refer to the standard, which tells us to round it to G3, and NatureServe has nationally ranked it as N3. IUCN has listed it on its red list as vulnerable. So our standard tells us that this is a global KBA trigger, A1B. So in this case, we're looking for 1% of these bumblebees, of the global population of the bumblebees, on the site and at least 10 reproductive units. So we move on to assessing our parameters at the site to global parameters. So we check the red list and other sources, and we find that the global number of mature individuals is unknown. It just can't be sampled accurately. So even though we know there are 30 adult bumblebees in our park, we have no way of knowing the national number. So we move on to our list of assessment parameters to global area of occupancy. This is listed in the red list as being a range between 501 and 2,500 kilometers squared. The KBA standard and guidelines tell us to use the midpoint, which is 1,500 kilometers square in this case. And we calculate our area of occupancy on the site as being 25 kilometers squared. So we compare these two values and determine that the site has 1.7% of the global area of occupancy. And we know it has 10 reproductive units. So this meets our KBA criteria and our thresholds. And this one can also move on to our next stage of assessment. Okay, that's it for me. Back to you, Jamie. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to briefly talk about data sensitivity training. So in our KBA work, we have agreements with various data providers across the country. In Canada, or in Ontario rather, we have a partnership with the NHIC that provides a lot of our spatial data for us. And we adhere to data sharing agreements with the NHIC and other organizations across Canada, including CDCs in various places. And so the reason I'm telling you this today is because we're going to go over a couple of case studies and I'm going to show you a little bit of data. We are allowed to show that data in a workshop setting like this, but we ask that you don't share any information that you see here today. So please don't take screenshots or distribute recordings or images of the data in any way, because careless disclosure of detailed location information for at-risk species could result in the species being illegally harvested or prosecuted in some way. So enough with that. Once you go through the process of identifying a KBA, so you have found a site that has biodiversity that meets those KBA thresholds using calculations as Robin described, one of the next steps then will be to delineate the KBA. So the aim for delineating the boundary of a KBA is to derive boundaries that are ecologically relevant, but also practical for management. I'll say now, and I think it's going to come up later as well, that there is no minimum or maximum size for a KBA. It's meant to be a site scale. It's meant to be a site that is manageable, and that's open to a bit of interpretation. It can depend on the context for what we're going to what we consider a site and manageable. So the actual process of going through the delineation is an iterative process. One of the very first steps will be to assemble spatial data sets. So any spatial data you have for the biodiversity element you're interested in this case, we'll talk about species rather than ecosystems. So any observations or range maps you might have for your species of interest. Then the next step would be to derive some initial site boundaries based on ecological data. And there are lots of different ways you can do this. Again, it depends on the life history of the species and the location. Often we rely on contextual information, things like site's elevation or land cover or habitat distributions or waterways. It all can depend, but there are lots of different contextual layers that we can use that are very, very helpful for deciding what these ecological boundaries should be. And one of the most important information sources for determining those ecological boundaries will be experts who know the site and species very well. The next step will be to refine the ecological boundaries to yield practical management boundaries. And it's also very important to document that delineation process really precisely so we can defend it and that it's understandable and it makes sense. And so that includes both things like describing what contextual layers you might have used to identify boundaries, whether it was mapped to a specific elevation or mapped based on imagery of habitat, and also describing the process, so how decisions were made about that delineation, who was consulted, information like that. And so, as I've hinted at, this delineation process occurs in consultation with relevant knowledge holders who do know the site and species very well. Here's some definitions. So a site is a geographical area on land or in water with defined ecological, physical, administrative, or management boundaries that's actually or potentially manageable as a single unit. Manageability, the possibility of some type of effective management. There's no minimum or maximum size for a KBA, but boundaries for KBAs are fixed. They're non-dynamic, they cannot change until the site is reassessed. And KBAs need to be reassessed every 8 to 12 years, and that would be an opportunity to change the boundary if needed. But we can't have dynamic boundaries for KBAs. So again, some steps in the process for delineating KBAs and developing these ecological boundaries. You want to start with spatial data for your KBA element. So that might be your trigger species or trigger species plural. You can use existing boundaries if they're relevant to the scale of the KBA boundaries. So for example, if you have a small park that your species occupies most of the area in, then it might make sense to adopt the park boundary as your KBA boundary. We learned pretty quickly in this process in Canada that that doesn't always make sense for us. We have identified some trigger biodiversity elements in Kluane National Park, for example, and the area they occupied was just so much smaller than the scale of the park that it didn't make sense to adopt that boundary. But again, you can look at whether that makes sense on a case-by-case basis. When there are no existing boundaries that you might want to adopt, you can draw the boundary to encompass the trigger elements, and you exclude any land or water that isn't relevant. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in the case studies, but some KBAs will just be delineated really tightly around one element occurrence, for example, for a trigger species, or you can include other areas or multiple different observations for one or more trigger species. Again, like I mentioned, topographic or environmental data might be useful. And one of the very important steps to remember as you're going through this process of delineating a KBA is that you need to ensure that however you delineate the site, that the biodiversity elements within that boundary still meet the quantitative thresholds. So you need to make sure that the site is big enough that it's capturing a large enough population size to meet the thresholds for a KBA. And then, of course, as I mentioned, this is an iterative process, so there'll be multiple steps of refining the boundaries as well. Once you have delineated a site, a step for actually going forward and nominating a KBA, a proposed KBA, is to fill out a standardized nomination form. And so this nomination form has been developed. You can reach out to us to get information about it. And it captures a bunch of different information, including information on the trigger biodiversity elements themselves. So things like the threat status, population size, or extent of an ecosystem if you're identifying a KBA for an ecosystem rather than a species. Has information about the site, including a site description, the rationale for how you delineated that site, information on the customary jurisdiction of that site. You can list additional biodiversity, threats to the biodiversity or to the site itself, and the conservation actions that are either ongoing or needed at the site. And finally, a very important part of the KBA nomination form and proposal process is the description of the consultation that went into that form. So people who aided in the development of it or went on to review the site. Now, in terms of review, every KBA has to undergo multiple different stages of review. The first stage is a technical review stage in which we ask experts and knowledge holders who know the site and the species really well to provide a review on the technical details of the proposal. So things like whether the data that went into the calculation of thresholds is up to date and makes sense and is accurate. Also, whether the boundaries we drew are appropriate for that species. After the technical review stage is complete and we've integrated the information we receive from the technical review, the sites each then go through a general review stage. And this is an opportunity for any other knowledge holders or rights holders or landowners or stewards to take a look at that proposal and provide us with any input that they would like, including information that we may have missed when we developed the proposal. So things like information about how we describe the site or the species that are located there, or any information they'd like to share, really. And we make sure that we go through a process that's very broad to make sure that we're including everybody we can in that general review process. So not only do we identify stakeholders and rights holders ourselves that might be interested in providing input on this site, we also reach out to individuals on the National Steering Committee for the Pathway to Canada Target 1 who might be able to identify stakeholders. We also ask every individual that we reach out to for a general review if there are additional people they think we should reach out to. So we try to capture as many perspectives as we can in the development of these proposals and through the review process. Once the general review stage is complete, we take it back at the Secretariat, give it one last look over, go through checklists and make sure that everything is filled out accurately. And then we send it to the Canada KBA Management Committee, who will review the sites and accept them if they are acceptable. And finally, for global level KBAs, those proposals then go on to the global KBA Secretariat, where they need to go through a review process and be accepted there. So as a whole, the review process for KBAs is quite involved and can take quite a long time. So now we'll go over a couple case studies. And as I said, again, with the data training, please don't share any of this data, but if you have questions, let us know. And again, as I go through these case studies, I just want to say that I'm certainly not an expert in these species, so I am familiar with the KBA proposals and the process that's being done to date. And I see a couple names here of people who are experts on these species and sites. So if you would like to share your perspective, we would love to hear it during the Q&A period after these case studies. So the first case we're going to talk about is a proposed KBA for Severn River, which has been triggered by Engelmann's quillwort as a KBA. And so this is a national level KBA candidate, and it meets criteria A1, A, C, and E. So those are the criteria for a endangered species or a level 1 threatened species. So it's both listed as endangered by COSEWIC and as Nature Service N1. Criterion C actually shouldn't be, A1C shouldn't be on this slide. Like Robin mentioned earlier, C is for species that are declining. And we may or may not be applying that at a national level. I'll maybe let Kira talk about that a little bit more later if we have questions about it. But regardless, it does meet criteria for A1A and A1E. Actually, sorry, this slide is outdated. It's A1A only because there are 2 sites in Canada for this species, and A1E would require the entire population to be within 1 site. So it meets criteria A1A as a endangered species. This species came up to us as a potential trigger species during a freshwater workshop that we had in early 2020 before the pandemic. We had a freshwater workshop in Montreal where we had freshwater experts from across the country and went through an exercise of trying to identify some freshwater sites that would be shoe-in KBAs across the country. And this is one of the ones that came up. And so this is a aquatic plant. And I will just go through and show you some of the data and the process of how we identified this now. So we talked about the site at a workshop. Some of the experts that were present there recommended that we might be able to identify 2 KBAs for the species actually at 2 locations, which are the only 2 locations for the species in Canada. One is at Severn River here, and the other is at Gull River, which I won't show you today. Robin or Kira, can you confirm that you can see my GIS now?
Yes, I can see it clearly. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And so our first step then was to take a look at attribute data, or sorry, parameter data for values that we can use to calculate the assessment thresholds. This was an easy KBA because there are only the 2 sites in Canada, so we could use the number of localities. I believe we also used the number of mature individuals for the assessment of this site. And then our next step was to look at the spatial data and to try to figure out how we were going to delineate the site. And so what you're seeing in orange here are element occurrences for the Engelmann's quillwort at this site. And so there are a couple occurrences over here, lots in this area. And these occurrences, of course, correspond to and overlap with critical habitat that's been identified for this species in the COSEWIC recovery plan. And so with consultation with the experts who know the species really well, we decided in this case to adopt the existing boundary of critical habitat for the species and to use that as our key biodiversity areas boundary. And so that's what you see here in green is the critical habitat for the species, which I believe includes all of the observations as well as I think some buffer on either end of the most distal observations and also up and downstream areas that were identified as being critical. And so the next stage then for this KBA was to develop the nomination form, which we've done. And I can actually show you a brief summary we put together. So this isn't the nomination form itself. This is a summary that's developed from the nomination form that captures all the information about the site. So this qualified as A1A as a critically endangered or endangered species, and also B1 as a geographically restricted species. We have information about the site description, the assessment details. Yes, we use number of mature individuals. So here we have both an estimate at the site of the number of mature individuals and an estimate of the national population size of the number of mature individuals. So we know that 63.1% of the national population of this species is found at this site in Severn River. We have our delineation rationale saying it was delineated by georeferencing the critical habitat map, rationale for site nomination, that it's one of 2 locations of the species in Canada, and other information about the customary jurisdiction, ongoing conservation actions, threats, etc. So that's one of our case studies. The next case study I'll discuss is for Heinz Emerald. Again, this was brought up to us as a potential for a KBA at the same freshwater workshop by Colin Jones, who's on the call here today. And we identified mincing wetlands as a potential KBA for this site. Similarly to the Severn River example with Engelmann's quillwort, this species is very, very geographically restricted, and mincing wetlands is actually the only location for this species in all of Canada. And we ended up having information on the number of localities, both in Canada at this one site and also globally. I think there are something like 46 localities for the species globally. And so based on that information, we knew actually that this species would trigger a global level KBA because it meets A1E for a national population, but there's having one locality out of 46 in all of the world also means that it meets the criteria for a global KBA. And so similarly, we talked about this species at a workshop. We had this information about the number of localities available to us, so we knew that it could trigger a KBA. And our next step then was, of course, to delineate the site. Just give me 1 second while I pull up the correct site. So again, in orange here, you see kind of this scatter plot of EOs, and EOs are made up of observations, source features for the species. And this is located, like I said, in the Mincing wetlands, which is also an ANSI site, an area of scientific and natural interest. And we ended up delineating this KBA using a couple different approaches. First, we thought that maybe we would just encircle these observations and call that the KBA. But Colin, based on his expert input, sorry Colin for putting you on the spot, was that we should actually include some more of the wetland area that was really important for feeding for the species. And so if we take a look at the imagery, rather than this other base map, you can see the area of the wetland here. Based on Colin's expert input, we knew that some of this area in the wetland was very important. And Dave is writing in the chat some other potential species in close proximity, and I'm really glad that you brought that up because we started identifying the site only for the Heinz emerald dragonfly, but Robin is actually doing some additional species research now for potential additional trigger species for this site as well. So I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit more in the chat or offline as well. So the way we ended up delineating the site then was to first make sure that we were capturing all these different observations within the boundary, making sure that we were capturing the area of the wetland that, based on Colin's knowledge, was really important for the feeding of the species. And then there's also that existing ANSI, like I said, that this is an area of scientific and natural interest. So I also ended up using the ANSI boundary to figure out the outer edge along this eastern side, how that should look. I adopted the ANSI boundary in some places. And so with delineation, it's important to note that there's not only going to be one delineation solution for a site. We have all of these principles and different steps that we go through to make sure it's ecologically relevant and it's a manageable size. But there is a bit of an art to it, and that is really important to keep in mind, and especially when you are consulting with various experts to make sure that the delineation makes sense for that specific context and that specific situation. So like I mentioned, Robin is continuing to do a little bit of research for additional trigger species at this site. This delineation is still proposed and under development. We've gotten some comments from other technical reviewers who are on the call that it should be expanded in some ways. And so this is very much still in the works and is being iterated on as we speak. And I think that's it for me and for the case studies, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Jamie. I guess now we'll open things up to any questions. If anyone wants further questions in the chat, questions or comments on the case studies or anything else that we've talked about. And we'll also give you the opportunity to unmute yourself if you could just raise your hand.
Al's got his hand up. I'll ask you to unmute, Al.
Thank you. So My question is about the when the national standards were being developed. I mean, I could think of a number of areas that probably wouldn't qualify using the existing criteria, but they have multiple species that are probably close to meeting the threshold, but don't quite make it. And given our difficulties in looking at ecosystems at risk, particularly in aquatic environments, I wonder if there was any consideration or thoughts for the future of trying to develop criteria for sites that have multiple species of conservation concern in them, but don't quite meet the current national or global KBA standards. Thanks.
I can answer that question. So I'm Kira, and thanks for being here, all of you, and including Al. So it's a great question, and I think that this is coming up quite often. In fact, people write to me on a regular basis talking about really remarkable sites across Canada that hold unique biodiversity values, but often below thresholds that are required to trigger a key biodiversity area. It's a tricky one because basically we were very conservative in our adaptation of the national standard from the global standard because for a couple of reasons. One, it was 12 years in development, the global KBA standard, and all of the taxonomic groups were tested by experts in different contexts and ecosystems across the world. So there was a lot of testing to find out, what should those thresholds be? Will they, if they're a little bit too low, will they, wallpaper the world with key biodiversity areas? If they're too high, will nothing qualify and we'll be missing really important sites for conservation? And so this is the level that we ended up with, and we've just adopted the same thresholds for Canada, but based on the Canadian populations instead of global populations, and then also allowing things like taxonomic groups below the species level, which are not allowed at the global level. So that very conservative adaptation will certainly make it so that some sites that are important will not meet the thresholds. This is something that can be adjusted with time, but it's not something that we want to adjust right away. It's something I think that the standard needs to remain stable for a while, and certainly there are hundreds of KBAs that are being identified across Canada. So I think that once we've identified all the ones that we can identify using the current standards, we can take a look, and I think that there will be a chance for some expert group meetings to take a hard look at what we've achieved, what the outputs look like, what we've missed, and then sort of maybe adjust if needed. The other thing is that we are just starting to get into the ecosystem criteria, which are much more difficult to apply, and they haven't been tested so much at the global scale. And so we do hope that some of these sites that are important for multiple species may be captured under the ecosystem criteria. And we've just hired an ecosystem criteria coordinator to really look into that question. So we'll have some expertise to be able to apply those criteria in the coming couple of years. But it's a great question, and it's not a perfect answer.
Thank you, Kira. We also have Namrita with their hand up.
Hi, I'm from TRCA, Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. So great presentation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the nuances involved in a project like this. My question is related to the previous question, actually. But I'm thinking a bit more, if you could shed some light on your thinking around representation of some of the urban areas. So because as we know, the One Nature, the federal government's commitment towards the ecosystem management, conservation, and so on, it has explicitly recognized some of the other effective conservation areas, method, and so on, which kind of recognizes the contribution of urban landscapes into the biodiversity conservation and so on. But in my mind, the criteria that we have right now, which you have done a pretty good job of kind of scaling down for our national scale, it will probably not capture the contribution of urban landscapes in the biodiversity conservation side of things. So I very much agree with Kiara's previous comment that, it's a work in progress and there's probably going to be more work needed into future. Has this conversation happened as we are delineating the KBAs? And if not now, will there be some sort of text that kind of re-bolsters this contribution of urban areas into the biodiversity conservation and so on, if not the criteria and so on, at least at this time, maybe acknowledgement and some consideration in terms of what can be done in future or maybe at a different scale, because a lot of provincial and even regional level, there are work being done and initiatives and provincial policy statements that ask us to delineate some key important areas for biodiversity and so on, which may not fit the standards of KBA, but regardless, it's still there. So some sort of, I think, acknowledgement of those might be helpful, just to make sure that we are vertically integrating at different spatial and policy scales.
I might take this one too, just because it's a broad question, and thank you very much for it. I'm a huge believer in the importance of showing the value explicitly of biodiversity in urban areas. I think that that's a lot of the biodiversity that people have access to, and it can really, focusing on that can change value systems, which is what we need to preserve and conserve biodiversity and steward it appropriately at all scales. So great point. A couple of things. One is that KBAs have been already and will continue to be identified in all landscapes. So there are urban key biodiversity areas and peri-urban key biodiversity areas in different places. So that's my first point. And so it's possible that even around Toronto, probably not downtown Toronto, but in other urban areas in Ontario, key biodiversity areas may be identified. But it's hard the more urban you get, for sure. My second point is that this is not the only tool. It's very important to recognize that key biodiversity areas are something very specific. They're not the sites that are important for all biodiversity. They're sites that contribute disproportionately to the persistence of biodiversity. So they're sites where if you remove that site, particular biodiversity elements will suffer. And these are ones that may be vulnerable because they are either already under threat or they're geographically restricted. And so if they're only in a couple of sites and you remove a site, that species is getting closer to extinction or extirpation. So they are trying to do something very particular. And some of the criteria allow us, so for example, criterion C, which is large areas of very high ecological integrity, allow us to capture something a bit beyond that. It allows us to capture, ecological processes, connectivity in the landscape, because these are much larger sites. But the ones that we're talking about today, especially that will be identified in Southern Ontario, are mostly focused on species and smaller remnant, ecosystems like alvars that are under threat or grasslands. So there is a need for other tools as well. In fact, for all tools really, to complement key biodiversity areas that focus on places that have cultural importance, biocultural importance, places that are the last remaining green spaces in urban areas that provide ecosystem services. There are so many other things that are really important too, that may not be captured by key biodiversity areas. So this is one tool of many, and we're focused on this right now, and we do think it's important because we're identifying sites that would fall through the cracks if there were other criteria or we were looking at other types of things. So they will be really important to making sure that we don't lose biodiversity in Canada, but they won't be the only tool that's important for stewarding green spaces in Canada for both people and ecosystems. But we are certainly open to the urban questions. We'll see what we can achieve.
Thanks, Kira. I just want to point out as well that Amanda Beacle from Birds Canada put in the chat that the Leslie Street Spit is a great candidate KBA. So just a reminder, I don't think we've talked about this meeting, but the important bird areas are being transitioned to key biodiversity areas. They're being reassessed as KBAs. So there are historic or legacy IBAs within urban areas and downtown Hamilton and places like that as well that will be reassessed as KBAs. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'll give everyone another moment to put any questions that you have in the, or comments in the chat, or to raise your hand. But if there are no other questions or comments, just please reach out to me. You should all have my email from the invitation, and if not, I'll put it here in the chat. Just reach out if you have any questions, or you're looking for more resources, either back to the basics on what a KBA is, or if you'd like further resources on exploring topics beyond just what we talked about today. We have a question on our timeline to the KBA identification. Thank you for that. That's a great question. So in Ontario, our project started in April, and we have a 1-year timeline to assess all of these, to map and assess the KBAs and submit them for nomination. So right now I'm working on just starting to go through our trigger species list and all of the KBAs that have been suggested to date. And then I'm going to be working through starting to identify some preliminary KBAs in the next few months, and then working towards the nominations in the next year or so. Question about KBA timeline. Are the nominations closed? Is there a nomination deadline? So no, the nominations have not closed. There is no firm deadline. We're just working through the province to try to just do preliminary identification of where they might be right now. So if you do have any suggestions, please reach out and we can work together on these. Okay, we have a question from Nigel. Other than strict protection, will there tentatively be other management actions that will be recommended for areas that might meet the triggers? How might lands that are private be considered? And how might management recommendations differ for those lands that are public/crown/government owned? Kira, are you?
Sure, that's a great question again. And in fact, so a lot of the delineation guidelines that we're following, we've been slowly adapting from the global guidelines, but we're finding that in Canada, as Jamie mentioned, for some of our enormous protected areas and parks, we can't really follow their guidelines. And so we're adapting and checking with the global secretariat on what's acceptable. And so the size of Canada is kind of special in the world, but also the way lands are managed really differs from place to place and across different scales. And so we're often finding that we need to focus more on ecological boundaries of key biodiversity areas and less on management friendly boundaries, because they cross sometimes different, sometimes many private properties or different, Crown and other lands, or First Nations lands. So again, we're looking at each particular context and trying to find out what's appropriate. So a good example is in Manitoba, where we're looking at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, which is sites that in some parts are managed by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, some are private ranch lands, and it would be wrong to suggest what is the most appropriate for us anyway. It's beyond our scope to suggest what the most appropriate management is. So we look to the people who are working on conservation and stewardship and management in those places to find out, well, what is appropriate there, and again, sort of leaving it in their hands to be able to talk to everybody and to at least ensure that everyone understands what a key biodiversity area is and what it isn't, how it can help their ends, allay fears about how it could impede their work, like it has no impact on access to land, it has no management prescription, and that seems to be the approach that is working well, that people respond to, and so it's really site by site, group by group, trying to figure out what's appropriate. And certainly there are NGOs that are interested in key biodiversity areas to push particular types of management beyond, again, the scope of the scientific work of just identifying the sites. There will be community stewardship groups who may be interested in doing something similar. There will be lots of times where it's no formal protection is necessary. In fact, some of these places we're celebrating because they still exist. That these are some places that have been successfully stewarded and still exist after thousands of years. So if that is going well, we want to celebrate and point that out. And if there are threats, then we want to make sure people know that these sites are there, and then they can sort of figure out on appropriate actions. Sort of a roundabout answer. Happy to elaborate a little bit, or maybe Robin or Jamie could as well.
I don't think I have anything to add. That was a good answer. Thank you, Kira.
And just to follow that up, Nigel here, I think it's an incredible first step to first identify areas of importance and key biodiversity areas. And this is a tool in the toolbox, and it's an important tool. And I think it's that first step to quantitatively and qualitatively go through and evaluate these sites. And then from that empowers subsequent actions and triaging potential management actions. So certainly aware of that. I'm just wondering with your organizations, would there be my imagination goes wild here, and I get really excited about the opportunities. I did a lot of this sort of work out in Alberta, and now part of my role involves this in the Niagara watershed. So I just wonder if there's opportunities to at least get letters of recognition that might allow for grants. We could dovetail. I don't think United Nations is pretty poor for the IUCN doesn't have a lot of money, but perhaps we could leverage this information and start to plow new pathways forward for CAs and ENGOs and other organizations that have a similar interest. Do you envision supports at least at that endorsement, or whether there be avenues for funding for which we can start to at least maintain these irreplaceable areas, and also like support along the way? I mean, when I think irreplaceable, I think about Mark Sand, right? I think this is another tool in which we go about it and start to really look at cumulative effects and maintaining that irreplaceable baseline, which contributes to all these other areas. So I guess that's a big rant, and apologies. It's lunchtime, okay? I'm hungry. But what sort of supports might you be able to offer those who are interested in really jumping on board with these beautiful ideas?
That's a very timely question. We are about 2 years into this project, and we've really been focusing on figuring out how to do the science part of things, but with an eye to the future, with an eye to setting this up and so that users, conservation organizations, governments, indigenous groups could make use of this. And to be able to ensure that they can make use of this, everyone has to be aware of it. So we are really consciously trying to bring people in, trying to make sure that everyone has access to information, and anyone can ask questions about this with that idea. But so only now, though, are we starting to have a little bit more time to start thinking more consciously about what are the next steps in terms of how can this information that's really valuable be most useful to conservationists and to other information users. There was so you can contact me after. We had a meeting last week, was it already just last week or 2 weeks ago now, where we gathered together what we call very loosely the Key Biodiversity Area Coalition in Canada. And it's a group of NGOs, experts, academic institutions, governments who are all just interested. There's no, you don't have to sign up. Anyone can be part of this group. but anyone who's interested in either furthering the scientific work of identifying key biodiversity areas or making use of the information. And this was the topic of discussion, was how can sort of this community of experts and practitioners make use of this tool effectively, and maybe in some type of concert as well. And so there were a lot of ideas that came up. What you're mentioning was brought up. There are organizations that already know how they're going to use this information, like Nature Conservancy of Canada will be plugging key biodiversity areas straight into their their conservation planning tools, things like Marxan, in order to figure out, well, what are the top priorities for purchasing land for conservation. The Government of Canada, EGLC at the national level, has an interest in acquiring lands as well for protected areas or OECMs or other types of things. They're sort of waiting for us to feed key biodiversity areas in there as well. The land use planners in the department, well, I'm not sure what department it is in the BC government, is interested in key biodiversity areas to feed into their land use planning. We've been approached by a couple only so far, First Nations groups in BC who are developing proposals for Indigenous protected and conserved areas and are interested in finding out, are there key biodiversity areas in that land? Could that strengthen their proposals? It's a discussion. In terms of, I think that there's a need for every kind of approach, and the kinds of things that you're talking about, they require a little bit of organization, but I think that there are some organizations interested in that. So things like, how do you tie this to academic institutions so that, you know, graduate students are learning about key biodiversity areas and can contribute to their assessment and monitoring, for example. How do you figure out, how do you tie private corporations who are operating on lands where there are key biodiversity areas to providing some funds for stewardship to local stewardship organizations? I think there's tons of potential. We're a small group right now. We want to provide support to any partners who are interested in helping with those kinds of things beyond the science work that we coordinate. So I can share the notes from that meeting from last week if you're interested.
Great, thank you, Kira. We have a question from Douglas asking, is there any priority on KBA identification on lands with or without existing protection? Might make sense to identify areas that are not in parks, conservation lands, etc., as they may be more at risk. I'll answer from my side, and then if anyone has anything else to jump in with. I would say that right now we are using as objective as an approach as we can to find our KBAs within Ontario. So we're working both from the top and looking at areas that are known to have high biodiversity and to hold these species and assessing them against the thresholds. And we're also going bottom up and looking for the species that have the potential to be triggers, and then looking where they are within the province. So in this way, we're not really prioritizing anywhere that doesn't have protection or does have protection. We're trying to just find the areas that meet these triggers, because for some species, there might only be one KBA within the province, there might be none. So we can't really pick or choose too much where we're looking. I mean, we can choose which ones we assess first, but at the end of the day, they're all going to be nominated within the same short period of time. So I don't really think that would affect it, but we do understand that trying to find areas to add to conservation land planning is important. So hopefully some of these triggers will be found in areas that can then spur some sort of management or protection in the future. And hopefully this will come out of our work. Nigel said, agreed with Douglas, ownership should be identified and considered. Thank you.
And I'll just add to that to say that I agree with Robin. Most of the work we're doing here at the Secretariat is really just objective and trying to map out these areas across a region within a set of time, and in the case of Ontario, hopefully within a year. If there are individuals who are interested in a specific area, that we have had some groups approach us and say, we want to know if this area is a KBA. We can provide support and guidance if anyone wants to identify a KBA on land that they're interested in and see if there is potential for a KBA there.
Thank you, Jamie. Any other questions or comments?
While we're waiting for a last question or so, that question is interesting to me just because I'm observing what's happening at the global scale as well with key biodiversity areas. So there are groups around the world trying to identify key biodiversity areas. And the foundational key biodiversity area are really this huge set of important bird and biodiversity areas that Amanda Beekle from Birds Canada is the coordinator in Ontario, so she'll be involved in this work too. At the global scale, it's the sites that already exist that are easiest to assess because they already have boundaries and people already, and those species are well studied there. So in a lot of the new key biodiversity areas that are being identified elsewhere, like for example, across the African continent, they're mostly in existing sites, conservation sites, protected areas. Whereas in Canada, we have this sort of bottom-up approach that Robin described nicely, and it will give us an idea if we look at everything. Well, how many key biodiversity areas are under protection, and that's an indicator that is very interesting at the global scale too. It's being put forward as within the Convention on Biological Diversity. A lot of countries are reporting on that indicator because it's something that they actually have data on. So these, what's inside a protected area, what's not, are there other forms of stewardship? How are we dealing with these key biodiversity areas, which are sites where biodiversity may disappear? Those are all things that can be reported on, and in Canada, we're interested in those too.
Great, thank you. Namrata, do you want to unmute yourself and ask another question?
Yep. So just one, I guess, parting thoughts on this. So one of the thing, I think this relates partly to a few of the comments that was brought up earlier, including mine, which is, I think for the this is a great initiative, and I'm not trying to take away anything from here. I think this is a very important initiative, and having that, status and that concept coming right from the top at the federal level will be very, very important. Having said that, I think a lot of the ideas that are embedded within key biodiversity area, I think, like Kiara said earlier, it is connected to all the other tools that is available, that will be available into future. One of the things when we think about the implementation, what's next after you delineate KBAs, is about implementation. And that's where I feel that, I don't know whether there has been much discussion, and maybe there has been, I'm just coming into this process now, around the initiatives at other scales. So you successfully brought some of the national scale sort of parameters, downscale the global parameters into national scales, but there are a lot of initiatives happening at provincial and regional scales. And there are, especially I can speak for Ontario because that's where I work, with a provincial policy statement and the guidance around natural heritage system. There's a lot of work our municipal partners and province has done to undertake the systems approach to conservation, but also recognizing that there is this, key areas, natural heritage features and areas, as we call it, try to delineate that. So there are like similar concepts at that provincial and regional scales that we have spent, the conservation authorities especially have spent a lot of time developing and promoting and really putting on the ground actions, the practice and the partnerships and so on. So that's something that I just want to highlight, is that, for implementation moving forward, I think it'll be quite important for KBA concept to connect with those concepts that are already in place, so that it's not something brand new, but maybe it's more complementary for implementers to kind of bring into the fold and so on, and having that multiple support from different levels of government for the kind of work that we are trying to do. It will be unfortunate if the things are not lining up and things are not, aligning with the principles of conservation at these different scales if we haven't thought this through well from advance. So that's just like the key point that I just want to make for, I guess there's no question there.
Do you want to say anything about that, Robin? I guess what I could say at the national scale is that we, through the Pathway to Canada Target 1 National Steering Committee, we work very closely with provinces and territories. There has been some turnover in Ontario, and we have worked less closely with provincial partners in Ontario, which is often where we get a lot of advice in other provinces about who we should be working with and governments at different scales and how we can align within the specific conservation context in a province. So in Ontario, I think we're looking for partners like that. And if you're willing, I would say a conversation with Robin would be really useful, and you could provide some advice and tips. But we do have, well, Robin, why don't you continue? Because I think that you are sort of in contact with quite a number of people at this point to try to figure out that conservation context.
Yeah, I would say I'm happy to email or meet up and chat more on this, but we are working closely with different government partners as well as other NGOs in the province and the federal government. And we have partnerships with NHAC and the MNRF and ECCC. So I think we are trying to work in association with other groups.
And
in the best way we can, but we're always looking for suggestions and ways we can improve that to make sure that we're considering all aspects of information that's available and try to tie in with existing approaches. I hope that kind of answers your comment there.
Great. Yeah, and that's how we ended up here today, I guess. I think Conservation Ontario and conservation authorities will be your key partner in Ontario. So I think that is something that might be very helpful, and I'm one of them, but there are others today in the call. So I look forward to more of those partnerships for sure.
Thank you, and thanks for coming to our meeting and for spreading the invitations throughout the TRCA as well. We appreciate you all making it here today, and all the other conservation authorities as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I think that might be the end of our questions today then. Thank you everyone who made it today. As I mentioned, we are recording this, so if anyone in your network might have missed it, but you think might be interested, just reach out, and I'll be sharing the recording later this week with everyone who was interested, and you can feel free to share that as well. We're trying to incorporate as many different knowledge sets and collaborations into our work here in Ontario as possible. So we're always interested in hearing from you by email or other aspects. Yeah, and if you have any suggestions on KBAs you'd like to look at, we can work with you on that and see if they meet the criteria. And any other questions or comments as well, please reach out by email. Otherwise, thank you all for coming today. Have a great rest of your day.